I want to begin by saying thank you to a couple of musicians. We are graced to have Marie Wingett this morning, and Marie, the solo was absolutely wonderful. Also want to say thank you to Katie, our brand new music intern, and to the choir for sharing their music with us this morning. It always makes our worship service much more meaningful. I was doing a little bit of research on the Ten Commandments as I was preparing for my sermon, and I found some actual quotes from children who didn't quite get the Sunday school message right, whatever they were learning about the Ten Commandments, they didn't quite get them right. So I wanted to read a couple, just so that we understand how important it is to get these straight. This is actual writing from Sunday school papers for children. One, Moses went up on Mount Sinai to get the 10 Amendments. The first commandment was when Eve told Adam to eat the apple. The fifth commandment, and this is for us parents of teenagers, the fifth commandment is to humor thy father and mother. And of course, the seventh commandment is thou shalt not admit adultery. Ironic, right? Thou shalt not admit adultery. All kidding aside, the Ten Commandments are actually a very important topic in our public discourse about freedom and religion. Back in 2000, a judge named Roy Moore was elected to the Supreme Court of Alabama. Judge Moore is convinced that the founding fathers of our nation envisioned the U.S. as a Christian nation. And in honor of that, he went out and commissioned a 5,280-pound granite sculpture for the state courthouse in Montgomery. Now, he went out and he got private funds, and he had it privately funded and privately made. He went and got this bar rock, this granite from Vermont. It's the best in the world. It's absolutely flawless. This gigantic one, it's not gigantic in volume, it's gigantic in weight, is engraved with the Ten Commandments. It's engraved with some quotations from Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and it's also has some quotes from the Declaration of Independence. Now, it's probably about waist high and about 4 or 5 feet wide, but the fact that it is made out of this granite makes it unbelievably heavy. So once he got it in there, it was going to take quite something to get it out of there. He was sued by people in the state who felt that having that sculpture of the Ten Commandments was a violation of the First Amendment, which establishes a religion, that he was establishing a religion by putting it in the state courthouse. And a federal judge agreed and ordered him to remove this gigantic thing, all 5,280 pounds of it. Well, Judge Moore refused. He said that he had a right to do it. He said that it was in keeping with the First Amendment. There was a group of retired state judges who disagreed with him, and they voted to remove him from office for misconduct. Eventually, Moore removed this sculpture from the State House, but he has taken it around the country for people to see as he goes and talks about the concept of religious freedom, trying to rally people to his cause. And every time he does, he's got to have a 5-ton crane come in and pick it up and put it on the back of the truck because it is that heavy. And even a 5-ton crane buckles under the weight of these 10 Commandments he's got. You know, I think that image of this gigantic weight is the image that most people have when they think of the 10 Commandments. As Jim read that passage this morning, it didn't sound like light reading. It sounds like an unbearable weight. But people should have to follow that. And then, in fact, there's some kind of honor in bearing this humongous weight on the back of your life as you go through life. Author Thomas Long wrote in the magazine Christian Century, he said, most people cannot name all 10, but they are persuaded that at the center of each is a finger wagging, thou shalt not. And he says, for others, the commandments are a heavy yoke to be placed publicly on the neck of a rebellious society. It looks like a list of things not to do. How many times have we heard that phrase, thou shalt not? It sounds like there's an angry God ready to strike lightning on those who do. But this morning I want to paint a slightly different picture of the Ten Commandments. I want to make a case that the commandments are actually there to free us, to make us freer people. That they are not a 2-ton weight that we try to bear honorably. They describe how people can live with God and get together, get along with one another in a loving relationship. The Ten Commandments are how we should get along with one another and with God. It teaches us how to be family. It teaches us how to be neighbors. It teaches us how to be citizens. It teaches us how to be good sons and daughters. How to live, how to be healthy. And all of those things are good things. They're not heavy, awful things. They're good. There are things in life that prevent us from being good. And God is described in this passage as freeing us from those things. I want you to understand the backdrop of these commandments. The backdrop is one of freedom from slavery in Egypt. As you might remember, the story in Exodus is that the Israelites' ancestors were promised this land in what is now Israel. And God said, I will give you long life. I will give your nation plenty of posterity so that your nation will go on and on and you'll never die out. Unfortunately, famine caused them to leave their land and move down to Egypt so that they could get something to eat because they couldn't farm. And while they were in Egypt, after many years, they ended up as slaves to the Egyptians. While they were there, they were poorly treated by the Egyptians. Their behavior was very highly regulated. It was controlled. They couldn't make a lot of choices with their lives because the Egyptians told them what to do. But in the story in Exodus, God is able to overpower the Pharaoh in Egypt and leads them out of Egypt through the Red Sea towards the Promised Land. But between the Egypt and the Promised Land, there is this huge area of desert. They are freed up in that place, like children who have no sense of community, who not really had the chance to be free with one another. There's no rules. All they have is a leader, a guy named Moses, and they're not really sure about him. So while they're on their way to the Promised Land, God gets them ready for the life that they're going to live when they get there. God teaches them to live as free people for the first time in their lives. It's like a college student who suddenly has freedom. But God gives them this freedom by showing them some rules. The first one says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of slavery. They are set with the backdrop of God freeing them from slavery. That's the context in which I want you to read these 10 commandments. I also want you to remember that there are not the only 10 commandments in the Bible. In fact, there are over 600 that God gives to the people between this period and the time that they entered into the Promised Land. So why are these 10 so important? Why do we have these on our walls instead of some other commandments? Well, these 10 encapsulate what it means to live in harmony with one another. If you can't memorize all 600, maybe you can memorize these 10. This time that they are in the desert is a time of instruction, a time of growing up. It's also a painful time, because as they're out there enjoying this newfound freedom, they're wrestling with whether or not they actually want to follow the God who just saved their necks. Now, these commandments are divided into 2 groups. I'm going to show you the first group. They're there. First group is how to relate to God, and the second one we'll show you in a second is how to relate to other people. Let's take a look at this first group. The The first one is that there are to be no other gods. They are to worship no other gods, and they're not supposed to make any graven images, something that is carved out of wood or stone or something else, to represent one of those gods. In doing that, God is freeing them from these ridiculous practices of the people around them who are always carving and making images of their gods and then worshiping this piece of wood. They were freed from from having to do that. Their neighbors followed all kinds of God. There was this huge mythology that went along with the different gods that their neighbors had to try to follow, and it was hard to even keep track. And God says, "You're freed from that. I'm the only God you need to follow." They made, as I said, carvings out of wood and stone. And you remember, as they were traveling through the desert after Moses gets these laws, they build this golden calf out of whatever gold that they had. I want you to imagine what that would have been like. If you're running out of Egypt at the last minute, trying to escape Pharaoh, and his army is coming after you, how much of your own personal gold are you going to carry? They had to put everything they had into making this golden calf. Think about the sacrifice that they made. This golden calf was actually not the god. They envisioned the Canaanite god Baal sitting on top of this golden calf. How much ridiculous sacrifice did they make in order to build this golden calf? In the book of Isaiah kind of taunts his Babylonian captors in 46:1. He says, "These things you carry, these idols that they've got, are loaded as heavy burdens on weary animals." God frees the Israelites from all of this ridiculous thing with this command. There is no need to carve idols or try to figure out what other gods you need to worship. Now, very few of us carve idols in our lives. You and I usually don't go home and make something and then worship it. But the truth is that it is very easy for you and I to let something get in the way of our relationship with God. It is easy for us to allow money and possessions and relationships to become what God should be in our lives. And this couple of commandments warns us not to do that. It frees us from doing that. Another commandment is not to take God's name in vain. And when I was younger, I remember we learned that was the commandment that says you're not supposed to cuss, you're not supposed to swear, because that was taking God's name in vain. But that's not actually what this commandment is referring to. There are other passages which talk about that kind of speech, but this passage has to do with taking oaths. They would take an oath, and they would use God's name to take an oath to give certainty to something that they were saying, something they said they were going to do, or something they said was true. They would say, "I swear by God's name that this is true, or that I'm going to avenge somebody." And the way that you took an oath became an art for the Israelites. They had debates over what it is you swore by that was binding or what was not binding. If you swore by the temple, but you didn't swear by the gold in the temple, your oath wasn't binding. They made those kinds of ridiculous hair splitting. And Jesus comes along in the New Testament. He says, "You know what? Don't even bother with oaths. Just say yes or no." It frees you from worrying about whether or not your word is your word. Another commandment is to honor God by resting on the Sabbath day. It is a day to honor God and to rest your body, as we spoke about a couple of weeks ago. In the Old Testament, even God takes off on Saturday when God is creating the world. So if God takes Saturday off to rest, and God doesn't really need rest, then how much more should you and I take that day off? As Christians, we have chosen to worship God on Sunday as a celebration of Jesus' resurrection on Sunday. But we still need this day off. We still need to take a day to relax and refresh. Jesus, God is giving us freedom from anxiety over the temptation to work. If we do not take this time off, our anxiety is greater. Taking this time off, this day off, frees us to care for ourselves, and we need it. The remaining commandments in the list are commandments that show us how to live in loving relationships with other people in our lives. Honor our father and mother. Do for them what they did for us when we were children. Some cultures are critical of us in the U.S. because they say, you know, you Americans, you ship your parents off into nursing homes when you should have them in your own home, caring for them. And in some cultures, the generations should just simply live together, all in one home. But I think we're built a little bit different from other folks. Not only do we have a sense of independence, but our parents also have a sense of independence, a desire to have our own space. Most seniors that I talk to say that they would not want to burden their children with their presence. And there is a need for a greater level of care. There's availability of a greater level of care in some facilities than there is in your own relative's home. We're in a situation where it's difficult to balance the interests of caring for an elderly parent with the fact that we are loving towards our parents because God is loving towards us. No matter where you fall on this spectrum of having your folks live with you or caring for them in home, we can never lose sight of the fact that the decision is to be guided by our sense of God's love towards us. Even if we have boundary issues with our parents or how they raised us, or boundary issues. The next commandment is not to murder. And I have to say, it's pretty obvious that it's hard to be loving when you are murdering somebody. This commandment is not a commandment against self-defense. It's not a commandment against killing in war. It doesn't refer to suicide. It refers simply to murder. Now, most of us are probably not going to murder somebody in our lives. We generally think this commandment is for somebody else. But the truth is that there are times in our lives where some of us get angry enough to want to see somebody get hurt. There are times when we are angry enough to hate somebody. Later on in the New Testament, Jesus will say to his disciples, I know you know the Ten Commandments. I know that you know that you're not supposed to murder, but I'm telling you that's not strict enough. You can't even hate them. You can't hate them. Violence is rooted in that impulse. There's an impulse to control what you can't control by resorting to violence. Instead of doing that, the better thing to do is to deal with your anxiety about what you can't control. Deal openly with it. It does not have to be your master. It does not have to lead you to behavior that you know you don't want to do. When you are violent, it does not solve violence. It creates more violence. People cannot live in loving relationships and allow or engage in violence. There's a commandment about bearing false witness. Again, when I was younger, my parents would say, "See, Jim, this means you can't lie. Thou shalt not lie." Well, it's not exactly what it means. It's a reference to the practice of perjury in court, lying in court testimony. In order for the Israelites to have a loving society, they had to have a fair court system. In order to have a fair court system, people could not lie when they were testifying in court. Now, very few of us, again, are going to perjure ourselves. Hopefully we never get called to testify in court. But we will, and we do, mislead one another from time to time. Sometimes more often than we admit. That willingness to mislead one another is rooted in a sense that we can't trust one another. And if we can't trust one another, then we will mislead one another, and it spirals. There's this sense, I think some of us have, that people will suffer if they know the truth, so it's better not to know. I would say that the truth sometimes is painful, but it is freeing. Mark Twain had a quote. He said, if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. Because you're not trying to remember what you covered up. You're not trying to remember the lie that you told. You're not trying to fit it in with all the rest of the reality. I remember talking to a woman a number of years ago about the practice of counseling, her practice of counseling. She was a therapist, and she talked to me about some of the things she found as she was doing therapy. And she said to me, Jim, it's the lies that really cause us anxiety. That's what gets people. Because we have to keep up those appearances. Once we do them, God gives us the commandment to make us free from that anxiety. Another commandment is against stealing. Obviously, that's fairly straightforward, you would think. Stealing arises from a sense that somebody has something that they don't really need. Maybe that they haven't earned. It arises from a sense that you have been wronged, and that stealing from somebody else makes that wrong right. Sometimes it arises from a sense of desperation, a sense that the system is rigged against me. So I have no choice in my life but to steal. It's the only way I can pay the bills. It's the only way I can survive. A number of years ago, in a hit tune called The Way It Is, rapper Tupac Shakur says something about this. He says, I had never done a crime I didn't have to do. Stealing is often a desperate move for people who feel they have no options. But stealing doesn't make desperate situations better. In fact, our society is ordered on respect for one another's property. And when that respect is not observed, there is a sense of fear that arises in everybody's minds. I want you to remember what it was like last summer and last fall when a spree of break-ins took place here in the northwest side of town. Some of you live very close to where these took place. It wasn't just about what was stolen. It wasn't just about the sense of being violated. It was the idea that if this can happen there, then none of us are safe. Stealing takes place in our society on all scales. It goes from break-ins to homes, to stealing retirement funds during the time leading up to the financial crisis, to people stealing music and video from artists. We steal from our servers at restaurants when we don't tip them adequately. Stealing is not a reflection of God's love, and you cannot have a sense of society if you don't have a sense of other people's property. The commandment not to steal frees us from that fear and allows us to live with one another with a sense of justice. That commandment is related to the other two. It says, thou shalt not covet. Don't covet. What is coveting? We don't use that word much anymore. I remember sometimes people would say to me, Jim, I would covet your prayers for this situation, but barely ever use that word. Coveting is this sense that you should have what somebody else has. And the way this is described in the Ten Commandments needs a little bit of translating over time and culture. Remember that these are being dictated 3,400 years ago, and things were a little bit different back then. It dates from a time when men owned everything. They owned their wives, they owned their children, they owned the livestock, their land, their children, etc. And there was a rivalry over wealth, over who had more possessions. It was more honorable to have more stuff. But today things are different. Women aren't the property of their husbands. They own their own property. Most of us don't own livestock. We honestly don't care how many cows the farmer outside of town has. Maybe we should, but we don't. We just care whether or not there's a good price on ground beef or steak or chicken breast at the store. And since the industrial age, we don't have to covet what our neighbor has as much, because we can just go out and buy one of them for ourselves. It's on the store shelf. But I think coveting today is different. It's rooted in a feeling of inadequacy. I am less because I have less. And if I could have what that other person has, or just like them, or more, it would mean I am more. If I had a spouse like that person's spouse, what would that say about me? How much happier would I be? The results of that kind of coveting, that kind of envy, is a higher divorce rate. It's people not getting married, not having lifelong relationships, people working longer and harder to get more things, cheating their bodies in the process, cheating their families, cheating their friends, all so that they can have the things that they covet. There is no sense that life is okay just because God is there with you. There's a restlessness at the root. A need to make your life better than the one that God has provided for you. That kind of coveting leads to the breakdown of society. You cannot live in a loving relationship with people while being envious of what they have and feeling inadequate. The commandment not to covet or to lust or to envy frees us from that kind of anxious, unhappy way of life. These 10 commandments are God's way of freeing people from practices and attitudes that make them unable to live with each other. Now you might say that what I'm suggesting doesn't hold water logically. You could say a commandment not to do something or to do something doesn't free you. Laws against drug use don't free people from the grip of addiction. Laws against driving under the influence don't free people from drinking and driving. They still do it. Making rules for your teens about their cell phone use doesn't free them from spending their entire lives staring at their cell phones. So how do these commandments free us? Don't they limit us? I would respond by saying that these commandments free us because they don't simply exist out there in a vacuum. They are not simply a 5,200-pound granite weight. They come along with the God whose loving nature is behind their intent. They come along with the example of Jesus who lived those commandments out in his own life, and he taught his own followers to follow and understand those commandments. These commandments are received not just by us as individuals, but by us all as we try to honor them in our life as a community. It's not just a question of whether or not I'm going to tell a lie, or whether or not one of you is going to have an affair, or whether or not somebody else in the congregation is going to honor their elderly parents. We are all in this together. We depend on one another to follow these commandments. We need each other to follow them so that we can be a church together. You can't even be a church if you don't honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. It's much easier to have no other gods before our God if we're part of a community of people who are all wrestling about how to do that in our daily lives. The people of Israel received these laws as a nation, not as individuals, and it freed them to be able to live with one another once they had a land of their own. These commandments free us from behavior that makes us and other people miserable to the extent that we practice them. In his book, The 10 Commandments and Human Rights, author Walter J. Carlson, professor of Hebrew Bible at Wake Forest University, reflected on this point that I'm trying to make. He said, many persons in the Western world must surely believe that the loss of the 10 Commandments threatens to sweep away something vital. This is not primarily because they help maintain old ways, the customs of our forebears, and not because many of us long to return to an earlier time when people really believed the Bible and followed what it taught. No, the loss of the knowledge of the 10 Commandments means a loss in the understanding of what human liberty is, what freedom of the Spirit means, and how freedom is to be maintained in the world. It is when we honor these commandments, not as law, but as a way of living in grace with one another, that we are really set free to be God's people. We don't have that freedom when we're envious, when we're workaholics, when we're violent, when we're unfaithful, when we have stolen property. That's why those commandments are still vitally important to us today as we struggle to live together and to model God's image of community for the people around us. Let us pray. Oh God, we thank you for the freedom to be your people. We ask that you would bless us. Help us to be guided by these commandments as we learn how it is that we love our neighbor and love you. For it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.